Sometimes love finds us in the most unexpected places. At a dusty railroad station in Montana Territory, 1885, fate would weave together two broken hearts. A grieving widower, still wearing his pain like a worn leather coat, stops for supplies at the loneliest depot on the line. There he discovers a bride in white, abandoned by her groom's family for being too tall. Her quiet dignity in the face of rejection stirs something in his weathered soul, a reminder that life's greatest blessings often come disguised as misfortune. As the sun paints the sky in shades of amber, they share stories of loss and hope beside empty tracks. But could a hastily spoken vow between two strangers truly heal the wounds of their past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over the Montana mountains, like it always did, painting the weathered boards of the McKinnon ranch house in shades of pearl and gold. James McKinnon had been awake long before the sun, as he had been every day since Sarah passed. Sleep was a fickle friend these days, offering little comfort in the vast emptiness of his bed. The silver pocket watch on his bedside table showed 4:30. Sarah's photograph, tucked safely inside the case, smiled up at him as it had every morning for the past 2 years. Her eyes still sparkled with the same joy that had captured his heart 20 years ago, when she'd been nothing more than the pretty daughter of a neighboring rancher who'd caught him staring one Sunday. After church, "Another day, my love," he whispered, running his thumb across the photograph's worn edge. The morning ritual never varied, this quiet moment with Sarah's memory before the day's demands began. Outside, the autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter. James pulled on his boots, shrugged into his heavy coat, and stepped onto the porch. The ranch spread before him, 3,000 acres of good Montana grazing land that had been his life's work. His and Sarah's. The cattle were dark shapes in the pre-dawn light, their breath creating ghostly clouds in the cold air. Two of his ranch hands, Tom and young Billy, were already moving among them, checking for any problems that might have developed overnight. Good men, both of them. They'd stepped up without being asked after Sarah died, making sure the ranch didn't suffer while James wrestled with his grief. In the barn, James found comfort in the familiar routine. The horses nickered softly as he moved down the row of stalls, filling feed bins and checking water. Old Belle, Sarah's favorite mare, pressed her graying muzzle against his shoulder. She missed Sarah too, in whatever way horses understood loss. "List's getting long," he muttered, checking the paper tacked to the barn wall. Feed was running low, they needed more rope, and the general store had sent word that his order of winter. Supplies had arrived at the railroad station. The station master, Henderson, had been holding them for 3 days now. James paused, pen hovering over the list. The railroad station. Something about the thought of that lonely outpost made him uneasy today. Maybe it was the dream he'd had last night. Sarah, standing on the platform in her blue Sunday dress, waving as if she were just arriving instead of... He shook his head. 2 years of grief had taught him that some thoughts were better left unexplored. The morning progressed with the steady rhythm of ranch life. James worked alongside his men, mending a section of fence that the cattle had tested too enthusiastically. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, though his mind wandered. The pocket watch, heavy in his vest pocket, seemed to tick louder than usual. By mid-morning, the supply run couldn't be delayed any longer. James saddled his stallion Thunder, a powerful bay who'd been with him almost as long as Sarah had. The horse danced beneath him, eager for the 10-mile ride to the station. "Keep an eye on the north pasture," he called to Tom. "That wolf's been back, according to Peterson's boy." "Yes, sir." Tom nodded, understanding in his eyes. They all knew James hadn't made a supply run himself since the funeral. Always sent Billy or one of the others. But something was different today. A restlessness in his bones that demanded motion, change, anything to break the endless cycle of empty days. Thunder's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as they rode east. The pocket watch ticked against James's chest, keeping time with each stride. Sarah's photograph rode with him, as it always did, but for the first time in 2 years, he felt something else beneath his grief. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. Like the world had shifted slightly on its axis, though he couldn't say why. The railroad station waited on the horizon, a lonely sentinel in the vast Montana landscape. James had no way of knowing that fate had scheduled an unexpected arrival, one that would change everything. All he knew was that his list needed filling and the day was burning away. But Sarah's memory rode with him, and in the warmth of the autumn sun, her smile in the photograph seemed different somehow, almost as if she knew something he didn't, almost as if she were giving him permission to discover what waited at the end of this dusty trail. The white wedding dress had fit perfectly in Boston. Grace Thompson stood in the station's tiny washroom, studying her reflection in the spotted mirror. Now the hem hung awkwardly above her ankles, as if the dress had somehow shrunk during the long journey west, or perhaps she'd grown taller still, though at 28 such a thing seemed unlikely. Too tall, Mrs. Henderson had said, her thin lips pursed in disapproval. Nearly 6 feet. Why, you'd tower over poor William. The family simply cannot accept such an unusual match. Grace smoothed the wrinkled silk with trembling hands. The dress had cost 3 months of her teaching salary, ordered specially from a Boston dressmaker who tisked and muttered about making adjustments for her unusual frame. Now it seemed a foolish extravagance, like her dreams of a fresh start. In Montana territory, the letter from William had been so promising. A year of correspondence, sharing thoughts about books, philosophy, and their hopes for the future. He'd never seemed to mind when she mentioned her height in her letters. The measure of a person is in their soul, he'd written, not in the happenstance of their physical form. But William wasn't here. Only his mother and sisters had met the train, their faces falling in unified horror when Grace stepped onto the platform. The conversation had been brief, brutal in its politeness. They'd pressed train fare for her return journey into her hand and departed in their waiting carriage, leaving her alone with her trunk and her shame. Grace straightened her spine. A habit, ingrained since childhood, when her mother had constantly reminded her not to slouch, as if better posture might somehow reduce her height. The station wall calendar showed September 15th, 1885. She'd been in Montana territory for precisely 4 hours and 23 minutes. Outside the washroom window, the vast Montana landscape stretched to the horizon. So different from Boston's, crowded streets and neat row houses. The endless space should have felt liberating, but instead it only emphasized her solitude. Her trunk waited by the station master's desk, packed with books, simple cotton dresses, and all the careful plans she'd made for a life that had evaporated like morning dew. The next eastbound train wouldn't arrive until tomorrow. Grace had enough. Money for a ticket, thanks to William's family's generosity. She could return to Boston, to her tiny apartment above the schoolhouse, to the whispers and pitying glances from colleagues who'd warned her about the folly of a mail-order marriage. Miss Thompson, the station master's wife, knocked softly. "I've made some tea if you'd care to join us." The kindness in the woman's voice nearly undid Grace's careful composure. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'll be out shortly." She made one final attempt to smooth the travel-wrinkled dress. The silk rustled softly, like autumn leaves skittering across cobblestones. A silly, impractical thing for a woman who'd always prided herself on being sensible. But she'd wanted to arrive wearing it, to step off the train as a bride, ready to begin her new life. Instead, she stood alone in a dusty railroad station at the edge of civilization, wearing a too-short wedding dress and carrying little more than her dignity and a trunk full of dreams that no longer fit. The irony might have been amusing if it weren't so painful. Grace gathered her courage and opened the washroom door. She'd face whatever came next, as she'd faced every other challenge in her life, with her head high and her spirit unbowed. If life had taught her anything, it was that sometimes the path forward only revealed itself after all other routes were closed. The late afternoon sun slanted through the station's western windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Soon it would set, closing this chapter of her life. What the next dawn might bring, she couldn't guess. But for now, there was tea with the Hendersons, and sometimes small kindnesses were enough to help one face the next hour, the next minute, the next breath. James McKinnon noticed the wedding dress first, a flash of white silk through the station window that caught the late afternoon sun like a beacon. He'd come around the back of the station, leading Thunder to the water trough, when he saw her. Tall and straight-backed, she stood near the platform's edge, her face turned toward the distant mountains, as if they might hold answers to unspoken questions. The sight stopped him mid-stride. Something about her solitude struck him deeply. The incongruity of a bride alone at this lonely outpost. The way she held herself with quiet dignity, despite the obvious distress in her bearing. His feet moved before his mind caught up, years of Sarah's gentle influence guiding him towards someone in need of kindness. "Ma'am," he removed his hat, keeping his voice soft so as not to startle her. "Forgive my intrusion, but might you be waiting for someone?" She turned, and James found himself looking directly into eyes the color of summer sage. Not up, as he was accustomed to with most women, but straight across. She was nearly his height, he realized, and something in her expression suggested she was bracing herself for commentary on that fact. "No," she replied, then seemed to reconsider. "Yes, that is. I'm waiting for tomorrow's eastbound train." A trace of Boston refinement colored her words, but there was steel beneath the polish. James nodded, taking in the wrinkled state of her dress, the subtle redness around her eyes that spoke of tears carefully hidden. The story wrote itself in his mind, a mail-order bride, most likely, rejected for some arbitrary reason. His heart clenched at the cruelty of it. Without conscious thought, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a clean white handkerchief. Sarah's voice in his, memory reminding him to always carry one. "It's a mighty warm afternoon to be standing in the sun." He offered the cloth with a small gesture toward her face, where a bead of perspiration threatened to fall. She hesitated only a moment before accepting. "Thank you, Mr. McKinnon." "James." "McKinnon. I ranch about 10 miles west of here. Grace Thompson." She dabbed delicately at her forehead, then made to return the handkerchief. "Keep it," he said. "My wife—" He paused, the familiar pain sliding through him. "My late wife always insisted a person couldn't have too many handkerchiefs." Something shifted in Grace's expression. Recognition, perhaps, of shared loss. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "How long?" 2 years this past spring." James surprised himself by adding, "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, other times like a lifetime ago." Grace nodded, her fingers working the handkerchief's edge. "Time is strange that way. This morning I thought I knew exactly what my future held. Now," she gestured vaguely at the empty platform, "would you care to sit?" James indicated the station's wooden bench. "Seems to me standing alone with difficult thoughts isn't always the best medicine." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Your wife taught you that too?" "Sarah taught me most of what I know about comfort," he admitted, settling beside her with a careful distance between them, "though I'm probably not as good a student as she'd have hoped." The late afternoon air hung still around them, heavy with unspoken stories. In the distance, a meadowlark called to its mate. Grace smoothed her dress, and James noticed the hem's height above her ankles. "They said I was too tall," she said suddenly, as if the words had been waiting behind her teeth. "William's family. They took one look at me and decided I wouldn't fit." She turned the handkerchief over in her hands. "It seems absurd now that something so unchangeable should matter so much." James felt an unexpected surge of anger toward these unseen people who judged her so carelessly. "Folk can be cruel about the strangest things," he said, as if God's decision about how to make us was somehow a mistake that needed correcting. Grace looked at him sharply, surprise and something like relief crossing her features. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the shadows lengthen across the platform. James found himself noticing things. The intelligent cast of her features, the way she held herself with natural grace that belied her height, the strength evident in her quiet composure. "What will you do?" he asked finally. "Back in Boston, resume teaching, I suppose." Though, she sighed, the thought of facing everyone's pity. It's almost worse than the rejection itself. James understood. After Sarah's death, the sympathetic looks from neighbors had been harder to bear than the solitude. He fingered the pocket watch in his vest, feeling Sarah's photograph like a presence between them. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "what seems like an ending turns out to be something else entirely. Sarah used to say that God's got better imagination than we do when it comes to planning our lives." Grace's smile was real this time, transforming her entire face. "Your wife sounds like she was a very wise woman." She was. James felt the familiar ache, but somehow it was different now, more bittersweet than bitter. "She would have liked you, Miss Thompson." She had little patience for folks who judged books by their bindings, rather than their contents. Inside the station office, Stanley Henderson watched the pair through his window while pretending to sort mail. 30 years as station master had taught him to read people like telegrams, and something about these two caught his attention. The crumpled piece of paper on his desk, the telegram announcing Grace Thompson's intended arrival to the Whitman family, seemed to weigh more than its few ounces. Outside, the conversation between the tall stranger and the widowed rancher continued, their voices carrying softly through the open window. "Did you always want to be a teacher?" James was asking. Grace's laugh held a touch of remembered joy. "Actually, I dreamed of being a circus performer when I was very young. My height seemed perfect for the trapeze. My mother was horrified. She'd already decided I would marry a banker or lawyer. And instead, you chose teaching? Books were my refuge growing up. When you're different, you learn to find comfort in stories about people who don't quite fit in, but find their way regardless. I wanted to share that with children." She smoothed her skirts, a habitual gesture. "What about you? Did you always know you'd be a rancher?" James shifted on the bench, his hand unconsciously touching the pocket watch. "My father was a rancher, his father before him. But I actually went to college first, studied literature if you can believe it. Sarah." He paused, but the name came easier now. "Sarah used to tease me about being the only cowboy who could quote Shakespeare while mending fences." Grace's eyes brightened. "Which play is your favorite?" "The Tempest," he replied without hesitation. "We are such stuff as dreams are made." Something about that always spoke to me. Inside the station, Mrs. Henderson appeared at her husband's elbow with 2 cups of tea. "For them," she whispered, her eyes soft. "The afternoon's growing cool." Stanley nodded, understanding his wife's instincts. In their years here, they'd seen countless travelers pass through, hopeful settlers, broken dreamers, fortune seekers. But something about these two felt different, like watching puzzle pieces slowly finding their proper fit. He carried the tea out carefully, remembering how his own love story had started with a cup of tea in a London railway station decades ago. "Thought you might appreciate some refreshment," he offered, extending the cups. Their thanks were genuine, and Stanley noticed how they both automatically shifted to make room for each other on the bench, a small, unconscious courtesy that spoke volumes. He retreated to his office, but kept his window open. "I've been thinking," Grace was saying, her fingers wrapped around the warm cup, "about what you said regarding God's imagination. My grandfather used to tell me that when God closes a door, he opens a window. I never quite understood that until today." James looked at her thoughtfully. "How so?" "Well, I came here expecting one life and found it closed to me. But sitting here talking with you," she met his eyes directly, "I'm beginning to wonder if perhaps I was meant to arrive at this particular station on this particular day." The sun was settling lower now, painting the station in warm amber light. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, not the eastbound she'd been waiting for, but a westbound freight train passing through. James set his tea aside carefully. "Miss Thompson, Grace, may I share something that might sound strange?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "This morning I woke feeling different, restless. For 2 years, I've sent others to collect supplies, avoiding this station because it held too many memories of bringing Sarah here to catch the train, to visit her sister." He drew out the pocket watch, opening it to show her the photograph inside. "But today, something made me come myself. As if someone were guiding you." Grace finished softly. Their eyes met again, and in that moment, Stanley Henderson saw something he'd witnessed only a handful of times in his 30 years at this remote station, the exact instant when two souls recognized each other. The westbound train's whistle faded into the distance, its echo lingering like a reminder that some journeys end exactly where they're supposed to, even if it's not where they were intended to go. The decision crystallized in James's mind with the clarity of dawn breaking over his ranch. He reached into his vest pocket, past the watch with Sarah's photograph, to the small leather pouch he'd carried every day for 2 years. Inside lay Sarah's gold wedding band, which he'd been unable to leave at home, but equally unable to store away in some drawer. His hand trembled slightly as he withdrew it. The small circle of gold caught the late afternoon light, warm and familiar. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, "Love's not meant to be kept in a pocket, James McKinnon." Grace was watching the sunset, her profile noble against the darkening sky, unaware of the momentous thoughts running through his mind. The teacups sat empty between them, marking the hours they'd spent sharing pieces of their lives. "Grace," he said softly, her given name feeling right on his tongue. She turned to him, and the look in her eyes gave him courage. "I'm about to do something either very brave or very foolish, and I'm not quite sure which." Her lips curved slightly. "In my experience, the two often go hand in hand." James stood, his movements deliberate, then did something he hadn't done since asking Sarah to marry him 20 years ago. He knelt. The wooden platform was hard against his knee, but he barely noticed. Grace's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. "I know this is sudden," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "By any sensible measure, it's madness. We've known each other mere hours, but I believe with everything in me that God led us both here today for a purpose." He held up Sarah's ring, letting it catch the light. "This belonged to my Sarah. She was the finest woman I've ever known, and she taught me that love isn't about fitting someone else's expectations. It's about finding the person whose soul speaks to yours." Grace's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, but her eyes never left his face. "I'm not offering you a fairy tale," James continued. "I'm offering you a life that might be hard sometimes. Ranching always is. I'm offering you a man who's known grief, but is ready to know joy again. I'm offering you a future we'd write together, where your height would never be anything but another beautiful part of who you are." He took a deep breath. "Grace Thompson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you're stranded. Here, not because you need saving, but because in the few hours I've known you, I've seen more strength, grace, and wisdom than most people show in a lifetime." The silence that followed seemed to stretch like a Montana sky. Grace's eyes glistened with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Most would say, this is reckless," she said softly. "Marrying a stranger at a railroad station? I don't feel like a stranger," James replied. "I feel like someone who's been waiting to meet you without knowing it." Grace looked at the ring in his palm, then at Sarah's photograph in the open watch beside it. "Tell me about her." "She would have liked you," James said simply. "She always said God works in unexpected ways. I think she'd be glad to know her ring was helping two hearts find their way to each other." Grace reached out slowly and touched the ring with one finger. "Yes," she whispered, and then more strongly, "Yes, James McKinnon, I will marry you." As he slipped Sarah's ring onto Grace's finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been waiting for this moment, The setting sun painted the station in shades of gold and promise. Behind them, Stanley Henderson smiled and went to fetch his Bible. Some days, being a station master meant witnessing more than just the comings and goings of trains. The station master's small Bible was well worn, its leather cover smooth from years of handling. Stanley Henderson held it with the reverence of a man who understood that some moments were sacred, regardless of their setting. His wife Martha had quickly arranged what she could. A few late summer wildflowers in a tin cup, a clean tablecloth spread over the station's wooden bench, 2 fresh candles lit against the gathering dusk. "I'm not an ordained minister," Stanley explained, adjusting his spectacles, "but as a justice of the peace, I can perform legal marriages." He smiled gently. "Done it 6 times in 30 years here. Though never quite like this." Grace stood, tall and serene in her wrinkled wedding dress, which somehow seemed more fitting now than it had that morning. The dress that had been meant for another ceremony, another life, had found its true purpose. James had removed his coat and straightened his tie, brushing trail dust from his vest. The pocket watch with Sarah's photograph rested silently in his pocket, a quiet witness. "Before we begin," Stanley said, "I need to ask, are you both entering into this marriage of your own free will, without any reservation or coercion?" "Yes," they answered in unison, then shared a small smile at their synchronicity. Martha Henderson sniffed quietly and dabbed at her eyes with her apron. She'd seen enough of life to recognize true things when they appeared, no matter how unexpected their packaging. "The Bible tells us," Stanley began, his voice taking on a formal tone, "that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Marriage, in its purest form, is an act of faith. 2 people choosing to believe in each other in possibilities, in the mystery of love's timing." He opened the Bible to a marked page. "I've always been partial to 1 Corinthians for weddings, but something tells me you might appreciate something different." "James, I believe you mentioned Shakespeare earlier." James nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Then let me read from The Tempest. Here's my hand, and mine. With my heart in't." Stanley smiled. Simple words for a profound promise. Grace's eyes brightened with tears and recognition. James reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "James McKinnon," Stanley continued, "do you take this woman, Grace Thompson, to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise to love her, honor her, and cherish her in joy and in sorrow, in plenty and in want, from this day forward?" James's voice was steady and sure. "I do." "Grace Thompson, do you take this man, James McKinnon, to be your lawfully wedded husband? Do you promise to love him, honor him and cherish him, in joy and in sorrow, in plenty and in want, from this day forward?" "I do." Grace's voice carried the strength that James had first noticed in her bearing. The ring already graced her finger, Sarah's ring, now Grace's, carrying the weight of past love and future promise. Martha stepped forward and pressed something into James's hand, a plain gold band that had belonged to her father. "Every marriage needs 2 rings, she whispered. Grace took the ring and slipped it onto James's finger. Their hands joined again. Naturally, like 2 pieces of a puzzle finding their fit. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana," Stanley proclaimed, "and in the presence of God and these witnesses, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss they shared was gentle, respectful of their setting, but carrying the weight of their commitment. As they drew apart, the last rays of sunset painted the station window in shades of amber and rose, and somewhere in the distance, a lone meadowlark sang its evening song. Martha wiped her eyes again and hurried to fetch the small cake she'd been saving for Sunday dinner. Stanley closed his Bible and began preparing the marriage certificate, his precise handwriting recording this unexpected union for posterity. James and Grace stood together by the window, their joined hands silhouetted against the dying light. Neither spoke for a moment, each absorbing the magnitude of what they'd just done. Finally, Grace turned to her new husband. "What happens now?" James smiled, touching her cheek gently. Now we go home. The ranch is 10 miles west. Not much to look at compared to Boston, but it's good land, solid land. Home, Grace repeated softly, tasting the word. Then with a hint of mischief in her eyes, will Shakespeare be required reading for the ranch hands? James laughed, the sound carrying notes of joy that had been absent for 2 years. Only if you're doing the teaching, Mrs. McKinnon. The name settled over them like a blessing, new and ancient all at once, while outside their window, Montana's vast sky prepared to welcome its first stars. Thunder carried them both with steady grace through the gathering darkness, his hooves sure on the familiar trail home. Grace sat in front of James in the saddle, her wedding dress gathered carefully, his arm steady around her waist. Her trunk had been secured behind the saddle, everything she owned in the world, bouncing along toward a future she hadn't imagined possible that morning. The moon rose full and bright, casting enough light to paint the landscape in shades of silver. James pointed out landmarks as they rode. Peterson's Creek crossing, the old lightning-struck oak that marked the boundary of McKinnon land, the rocky ridge that sheltered the northern pasture from winter winds. There, he said finally, his voice warm near her ear. See those lights? That's home. The ranch house emerged from the darkness like a ship coming into port, a solid 2-story structure built of weathered wood and determination. Lamplight glowed in several windows, and smoke rose from the chimney in a welcoming spiral. 2 figures moved in the yard, their lanterns bobbing like earthbound stars. Tom and Billy, James explained. They'll have seen to the evening chores. He paused. I should warn you, they may be a bit surprised. Grace laughed softly. I imagine bringing home an unexpected wife might cause some confusion. Tom's steady as they come. Been with the ranch 15 years now. Billy's younger, but he's got a good heart. They're family in their way. His voice grew serious. I want you to know, this is your home now. Your opinion, your wishes, they matter here. They drew closer, and Grace could make out more details. A wraparound porch with a swing, flower beds gone wild but still showing signs of past care. A massive old cottonwood tree that must have been planted by the first settlers on this land. Tom reached them first, his weathered face showing surprise but no judgment as James helped Grace dismount. Evening, boss. Ma'am. His eyes took in her wedding dress, James's formal attire, and he nodded as if pieces were falling into place. Billy hung back, younger and less sure, but his smile was genuine. Welcome home, Mr. McKinnon, and he hesitated. Mrs. McKinnon, James said, and Grace felt the rightness of the name settle over her like a warm shawl. Grace, this is Tom Cooper and Billy Matthews. Gentlemen, my wife. The old brass key turned smoothly in the lock. The first of many doors, Grace, would open in this new life. James led her across the threshold, one hand steady at the small of her back. The main room was spacious, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and well-worn furniture arranged for comfort rather than show. Sarah liked to read here in the evenings, James said softly, indicating a deep armchair near the hearth. Said the light was best. He seemed to catch himself. We can rearrange things, of course. Grace touched his arm gently. It's a perfect spot for reading. Perhaps, she smiled, we could add another chair beside it? The tension in his shoulders eased. They moved through the house together, James pointing out the kitchen with its massive wood-burning stove, the formal dining room they rarely used, the study lined with bookshelves that made Grace's heart leap. With joy. You have Shakespeare, she noted, running a finger along the spines, and Dickens, Austen, James McKinnon. You've been hiding your scholarly side under a bushel. A man can't spend all his time with cattle, he replied, a hint of playfulness in his tone. Then, more seriously, they're yours now too, all of them. Upstairs he hesitated outside the master bedroom. I've been sleeping in the guest room, he admitted, but the main bedroom has better views, more space. He straightened. It's your choice, Grace. Whatever makes you comfortable. Grace studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the mixture of hope and uncertainty there. Show me both, she said. Gently, we'll decide together. The master bedroom was large and airy, with windows facing east to catch the morning sun. A quilt in shades of blue and green covered the bed, and a dressing table stood in one corner. The room held echoes of Sarah, in the arrangement of bottles on the table, the dried lavender hanging by the window. But they weren't overwhelming. Instead, they felt like welcome notes in a complex harmony. "It's beautiful," Grace said honestly. "A room meant for living, not just sleeping." James released a breath he seemed to have been holding. From below, they heard movement. Tom and Billy, bringing in Grace's trunk, the quiet sounds of the house settling around its new reality. "There's something else," James said. He crossed to a wooden chest beneath the window and withdrew a small box, beautifully carved with roses and vines. "Sarah made me promise. She made me promise that whoever came after her would have this." Inside lay a simple silver key on a blue ribbon. "It opens her garden shed," James explained. "She always said a ranch needs flowers as much as it needs cattle. The gardens have gone a bit wild, but the bones are there. She'd want you to have it, to make it your own." Grace held the key carefully, feeling the weight of trust it represented. "Thank you," she whispered, and they both knew she was thanking Sarah as much as James. A sudden whoop of joy from the yard startled them. Billy, presumably sharing the news with the rest of the ranch hands who were returning from the evening. "Browns!" James laughed. "Word travels fast on a ranch. Are you ready to meet your new family?" Grace tucked the key into her pocket and straightened her shoulders. "Lead the way, Mr. McKinnon." He offered his arm with an elegance that would have graced any Boston parlor. "After you, Mrs. McKinnon." Together, they descended the stairs toward the sound of welcome and new beginnings. The cookbook was stained with years of use, its pages dog-eared and marked with notations in Sarah's flowing hand. Grace found it on her third morning at the ranch, tucked away in a kitchen drawer. "Sarah's Recipes and Ranch Wisdom," read the cover in faded ink. Inside, between instructions for sourdough biscuits and beef stew, were little notes that made the previous Mrs. McKinnon feel less like a ghost and more like a mentor. "Add extra salt if cooking for Roundup crew," one note advised. "Cowboys work hard, need the minerals." Another. "Bake bread on Tuesdays when the morning light is best for seeing if the dough has risen proper." Grace ran her fingers over the handwriting, imagining Sarah standing in this same kitchen, learning its rhythms. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in its golden fingers, and somewhere outside she could hear James giving instructions to the ranch hands. "Mrs. McKinnon," Billy's voice came hesitantly from the back door. The title still gave Grace a little start of surprise. "Sorry to bother you, but some of the men were wondering—" He shuffled his feet. "It's just, we smell something mighty." "Fine cooking." Grace smiled at the young ranch hand. She'd spent the morning experimenting with Sarah's cinnamon roll recipe, determined to make the kitchen her own. "Come in, Billy. You can be my first taster." The boy's face lit up as she handed him a warm roll. His expression at the first bite was all the approval she needed. "Ma'am," he said reverently, "the boys are gonna think they died and went to heaven." Word spread quickly. By noon, every ranch hand had found some excuse to pass by the kitchen. Grace served them all with the quiet dignity that had first caught James's attention, learning names, noting preferences, beginning to understand the complex dance of relationships that made a ranch work. Tom, she discovered, took his coffee black but had a secret sweet tooth. Old Pete, who worked the forge, couldn't read but could recite Longfellow from memory. Young Joaquin, newest to the crew, missed his mother's Mexican cooking, which gave Grace an idea. She found James in his study that afternoon, going over ledgers. "I'd like to ride into town tomorrow," she said. "There are things we need for the kitchen." He looked up, reading her expression. "Anything in particular?" "I thought I might learn to make tamales." Joaquin's mother sent him her recipe. She settled into the chair across from his desk. "Sarah's cookbook is wonderful, but I think it's time to add some new pages." James's smile was warm with understanding. "I think that's a fine idea, though I should warn you, if you start feeding those boys tamales, They'll never want to leave. Good, Grace said firmly. They're family now. The next weeks fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Grace rose early with James, sharing quiet moments over coffee before the day began. She learned to time the bread baking, so the smell would greet the men returning from morning rounds. The garden shed key around her neck became a familiar weight as she began to reclaim Sarah's wild gardens, not erasing what had been, but adding her own vision to the existing framework. The ranch hands' initial awkwardness around their new mistress faded as they discovered her genuine interest in their lives and her willingness to learn the ways of ranch life. She kept a pot of coffee always ready, a listening ear for their troubles, and gradually the kitchen became the heart of the ranch. Once more, "You're good for them," James said one evening, finding her teaching Billy to read by lamplight after supper. "Good for all of us." Grace looked up from the primer, remembering her classroom in Boston. "They're good for me too. I never thought I'd find a whole family when I came west." In her room that night, she opened Sarah's cookbook to its last pages, now filled with her own careful handwriting. Beside the tamale recipe, a resounding success, and her grandmother's Boston brown bread, she'd begun recording her own observations of ranch life. "Watch the clouds over the North Ridge," she wrote. "When they turn purple-bellied, snow's coming within the day. Keep extra coffee ready. The men will need warming when they come in from checking the herds." And below that, love comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a cinnamon roll left on a desk, or a young man's proud smile when he reads his first full sentence. Sometimes it's the way the ranch hands tip their hats and call you Mrs. McKinnon, like it's always been your name. She closed the book gently, listening to the nighttime sounds of her new home, James's footsteps in the hallway, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind singing in the cottonwood branches. In the morning, there would be bread to bake and gardens to tend, lessons to teach and lives to touch. But for now, she simply sat in the peace of belonging, exactly where she was meant to be. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by young Pete Peterson from the next ranch over. "Ma wanted me to deliver this personal-like," he mumbled, handing the envelope to Grace. It was addressed in flowing script to Mrs. James McKinnon, and the weight of the paper spoke of social aspirations. Grace waited until Pete had ridden away before opening it. Inside, she found what she'd been expecting since word of their marriage had spread through the county. "My dear Mrs. McKinnon, news of your sudden marriage has caused quite a stir in our little community. We simply must welcome you properly. The Ladies' Aid Society cordially invites you to our next meeting." The letter went on with sugary phrases barely concealing the writer's burning curiosity. Grace handed it to James, who read it with a grimace. "Margaret Peterson," he sighed. "Self-appointed guardian of proper behavior for the county. Sarah used to say she could smell gossip cooking from 10 miles away." "We knew this was coming," Grace said, straightening her skirts. "We need supplies anyway. Shall we face the lions?" "Together?" James smiled, touching her cheek gently. "Together sounds just right." They rode into town in the wagon rather than on horseback, Grace wearing her best blue dress, not the ill-fated wedding gown which she'd carefully packed away. The main street of Silver Creek wasn't much compared to Boston, but it had everything a growing ranch community needed: general store, bank, church, and most importantly today, plenty of eyes to witness the McKinnons' first public appearance as man and wife. "Remember," James said as he helped her down from the wagon, "you've nothing to prove to anyone." But they both knew that wasn't quite true. In a small town, acceptance could mean the difference between belonging and isolation. The bell above Watson's general store announced their entrance. Inside, Mrs. Watson and 3 members of the Ladies' Aid Society just happened to be examining calico prints. Their conversation died mid-sentence. "James McKinnon," Mrs. Watson recovered first. "And this must be your bride." Grace met there. Curious stares with the same quiet dignity she'd shown at the railroad station. "Grace McKinnon," she said, extending her hand. "I'm pleased to meet you." She could see them taking her measure, her height, her Boston accent, the way she carried herself. But she could also see something else. Surprise at how naturally she and James moved together, the unconscious way he adjusted his stride to match hers, the gentle confidence in their interaction. "We're so glad you've come," Mrs. Peterson said, emerging from behind a display of preserving jars. "We were just discussing the Harvest Festival. The Ladies' Aid always organizes the baking competition. Grace makes the finest cinnamon rolls west of Boston," James interrupted, his voice carrying quiet pride. "The ranch hands have declared them better than Sarah's. Begging your pardon, ladies, but it's true." A small silence followed this pronouncement. Sarah's baking had been legendary in Silver Creek. "Well," Mrs. Watson said finally, "we'll look forward to tasting them ourselves." Her eyes softened as she watched James help Grace examine fabric for new curtains, his large hand gentle against the small of her back. They moved through their shopping list methodically. Sugar, coffee, the spices Grace needed for her expanding recipe collection. News of their presence spread quickly. The bank president's wife found reason to visit the store. The minister's spouse appeared as if by magic. Each time, Grace met their scrutiny with grace and James with protective attention. At the post office, old Mrs. Henderson, no relation to the station master, squinted up at Grace and declared, "Well, you're a tall one, ain't you? About time we had someone who can reach the top shelves in this town." Grace laughed, genuine and warm, and something in the atmosphere shifted. Later, loading their purchases into the wagon, they overheard Mrs. Peterson saying to Mrs. Watson, "Did you see how he looks at her? Like Sarah used to say, love's got its own wisdom." The ride home was quiet, but peaceful. The setting sun painted the prairie grass gold, and a cool breeze carried the promise of autumn. "Well," Grace said finally, "I believe we survived our first social battle." James chuckled. "You did more than survive. Though I suspect the real test will be those cinnamon rolls at the Harvest Festival." "Then it's fortunate," Grace replied with a smile, "that Sarah left such detailed notes about the judge's preferences. Page 32 of her cookbook. Right. Between the pickle recipe and her thoughts on proper pie crust." James took her hand, his thumb brushing over Sarah's ring, now thoroughly Grace's. "You're something special, Mrs. McKinnon. This whole town's about to figure that out." Behind them, Silver Creek's gossips were already revising their letters to distant relatives. The story of the tall bride and the widowed rancher was evolving from scandal to romance, proof that even in their small corner of Montana territory, love could write its own rules. The old brass lantern had hung by the kitchen door since before James's time, its glass clouded with age, but its flame still burning true. Grace had taken to filling and cleaning it each morning, a habit she'd learned from Sarah's cookbook notes. "Always keep the storm lantern ready. Weather turns quick in Montana." That wisdom proved prophetic one late October afternoon. The day had dawned clear enough, but by noon the clouds over the North Ridge had turned the ominous purple-gray that Grace had learned to read like writing. She'd just finished securing the garden shed when she heard James's voice, sharp with urgency. "Storm's coming fast," he called from the barn. "Bad one. Tom and Billy are bringing in what cattle they can from the north pasture, but there's a group still up by Peterson's Creek." Grace met his eyes across the yard, understanding immediately. "How many men do you need?" "All hands are already out. I'm heading up myself." "Then I'm coming with you." She was already moving toward the barn, gathering her skirts. "I can ride." "Well enough now, and you shouldn't go alone." James started to protest, then stopped, seeing the determination in her stance. It was the same quiet strength that had first drawn him to her at the station. "Get changed fast. We've got 10 minutes at most." By the time Grace emerged in Sarah's old riding clothes, James had Thunder saddled and Belle ready for her. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow and danger. She grabbed the lantern, newly filled and trimmed, and secured it to her saddle. They rode hard toward Peterson's Creek, the clouds rolling in behind them like a dark tide. Grace's lessons in ranch life over the past weeks served her well. She kept pace with James, understanding without words the urgency of their mission. Cattle could panic in storms like this, and panicked cattle meant dead cattle. They found the lost group exactly where James had feared, trapped in the creek bend where the high banks offered no easy escape. The first heavy snowflakes were already falling as they approached. "We'll need to guide them toward the low bank," James shouted over the rising wind. "Can you hold the lantern high? They'll follow the light," Grace urged Belle forward, raising the lantern. Its flame, protected by the aged glass, burned steady and bright. The cattle, already nervous from the storm's approach, began to move toward its promise of safety. The snow thickened, driven sideways by the wind. Grace could barely see James now, though she could hear his voice calling to the cattle, steering them with the skill of long practice. The temperature was dropping rapidly. She could feel ice forming in Belle's mane. A crack of thunder sent the cattle surging forward. Belle reared, startled, but Grace held firm, keeping the lantern high. "Steady, girl," she murmured, her words whipped away by the wind. "Steady now." Through the swirling snow, she glimpsed James wrestling with a trapped calf, its leg caught between rocks. Without hesitation, she guided Belle closer, lowering the lantern to illuminate his work. Together, they freed the frightened animal, James's strength and Grace's light combining to save the creature's life. The storm was howling, in earnest now, but the cattle were moving, following the lantern's glow towards safety. Grace's arms ached from holding it high, her face stung with driving snow, but she held steady. This was what it meant to be a rancher's wife, not just keeping house and baking bread, but being strong when strength was needed. They drove the cattle through deepening snow, across the creek's low bank, and down toward the valley where the ranch's winter pasture lay sheltered. The lantern's flame never wavered, though Grace's arms trembled with fatigue. Finally, incredibly, they heard Tom's voice through the storm. He and the other hands had gotten the rest of the herd to safety and come searching. With their help, the last stragglers were quickly guided into the protected pasture. "Mrs. McKinnon," Tom said, respect clear in his voice even through the howling wind, "that light of yours saved more than cattle today." It wasn't until they were back in the warmth of the ranch house, snow melting from their clothes, that Grace realized she was still clutching the lantern. James gently took it from her frozen fingers, setting it on the kitchen table where its flame cast dancing shadows on the walls. "You could have been killed out there," he said softly, rubbing warmth back into her hands. "So could you," she replied. "That's why you needed someone watching your back." He pulled her close, both of them shaking with cold and aftermath. "When I saw you holding that lantern high, never wavering, you reminded me of a lighthouse keeper I once read about, standing strong against the storm, guiding ships to safety." Grace leaned into his embrace, feeling the day's tension begin to ease. "We make a good team, Mr. McKinnon." "That we do. Mrs. McKinnon." He touched the lantern's warm brass. "Though I hope you know this means you're stuck with storm duty from now on. Nobody's ever handled it better." Outside the blizzard raged, but inside the lantern's flame burned steady and true, much like the love that had brought them together on a train platform just months before. And if the light seemed to shine a bit brighter than usual, well, perhaps it was just proud of its part in proving that the newest Mrs. McKinnon was every bit as strong as the ranch needed her to be. The packet of letters arrived on a crisp November morning, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Grace recognized her sister Elizabeth's precise handwriting on the outer envelope, but inside were multiple letters from her mother, her former teaching colleagues, even her elderly aunt in Connecticut, all of them responding to her hastily penned explanation of her sudden marriage. She sat in Sarah's reading chair by the fireplace, her reading chair now, and opened Elizabeth's letter first. "Dearest Grace, I confess your letter left me shocked, though perhaps not entirely surprised. You've always had a quiet strength about you, an ability to see worth where others might miss it. Still, marriage to a stranger, a widowed rancher, mother is beside herself, convinced you've lost your senses entirely. Grace smiled wryly, hearing her sister's voice in every carefully chosen word. Elizabeth had always been the practical one, the sister who did everything according to plan. But I find myself thinking of Jane Austen's heroines, finding love in unexpected places. Tell me truly, sister, are you happy? Not just making the best of things, as you've always done, but truly happy. The fire crackled softly as Grace reached for her mother's letter next. The paper fairly vibrated with maternal concern. My darling girl, how could you be so impulsive? After the disaster with William and his family, I'd hoped you would return. Home where you belong. Boston has many fine schools in need of teachers, and several gentlemen of appropriate height have inquired after you. Grace set that one aside for later. Her mother's well-meaning but relentless focus on her height had been one of the reasons she'd looked west in the first place. Instead, she opened a letter from Miss Barrett, her fellow teacher at the Boston Ladies' Academy. Dear Grace, the girls miss you terribly. Young Sally Andrews asked just yesterday when you would return to teach them about Shakespeare. I told her you had found your own romance worthy of the bard. Heavy boots on the porch announced James's return from the morning rounds. He entered, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of horses with him. Seeing the letters scattered in her lap, he paused. News from Boston. Grace held up her mother's letter with a rueful smile. Apparently there are several gentlemen of appropriate height eagerly awaiting my return. James crossed to her chair, his hand warm on her shoulder. And what do you think about that? I think, she said, covering his hand with hers, that height is the least interesting measure of a person's worth. He chuckled, then grew serious. Do you miss it? Teaching? Boston? Your family? Grace considered the question carefully, owing him her honesty. I miss certain things, the excitement of opening young minds to literature, the sound of the harbor in the morning, Elizabeth's laugh. She squeezed his hand. But I don't miss feeling out of place, like a tree grown too tall for its pot. Here I can stretch to my full height in all ways. James pulled Sarah's old writing desk closer, their writing desk now, and settled nearby as Grace opened the remaining letters. Some were kind, others questioning, a few barely concealing their judgment of her choices. Through them all, James sat quietly supportive, occasionally commenting on a particularly choice phrase about wild Montana territory or savage ranch life. Finally, Grace picked up a fresh sheet of paper and her pen. Will you help me show them who we really are? Together, they composed responses. To Elizabeth, they described the beauty of Montana sunsets and the satisfaction of work done well. To her mother, they sent a photograph taken at the Harvest Festival, showing Grace and James together, their height difference negligible and their happiness evident. To Miss Barrett and her students, they included pressed wildflowers from Sarah's garden, now Grace's, and promises of stories to come. Your sister sounds like someone I'd like to meet, James said as they sealed the last envelope. Grace looked up from addressing it. She did say she might visit in the spring. Then we'll have to show her that Shakespeare can flourish on a cattle ranch. He smiled. Though perhaps we'll keep quiet about how you made Tom cry reading King Lear last week. He was moved by the poetry, Grace protested, laughing. And Billy's dramatic reading of Romeo and Juliet was unforgettable, James finished. Sarah would have loved it. She always said ranch life needed more poetry. Grace gathered the letters, both received and sent, and tied them with a blue ribbon, a growing record of how love could bridge the distance between two worlds. Outside their window, snow began to fall softly, and somewhere in the barn, they could hear Billy practicing his lines for the Christmas pageant. All's well that ends well, she quoted softly. James drew her close. No, my love, this isn't an ending at all. It's a beginning written in our own words. The leather-bound ledger lay open on James's desk, its neat columns telling a story that made Grace's heart sink. She'd found it while bringing him his evening coffee, forgotten to ask permission to look when she saw his furrowed brow. Now sitting across from him in the study, she understood his concern. The cattle prices in Chicago, she said softly. They're still falling? James nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. Third month in a row. The railroads raised. Their rates, too. Between that and the cost of winter feed, he trailed off, but the numbers spoke clearly enough. The ranch's comfortable margin was disappearing like spring snow. Grace studied the careful entries in James's strong handwriting. Her years of teaching mathematics came to the fore as she traced the patterns of income and expense. "Show me the previous years?" He pulled out older ledgers, and together they spread them across the desk. Sarah's influence was visible here too, small notes in the margins about weather patterns, breeding records, market cycles. Grace found herself absorbing both the numbers and the wisdom between the lines. "Here," she said, pointing to a recurring pattern. Sarah noticed it too. "The prices always drop in winter, but they recover by spring roundup. We just need to weather these months." "Usually, yes. But we've never faced railroad rates this high before, and the feed merchant in Silver Creek is demanding payment up front this year. Seems half the ranches in the territory are behind on their bills." Grace stood, pacing the study as she thought. The ranch hands' voices drifted in from the bunkhouse, Tom telling one of his endless stories, Billy's young laugh, old Pete's harmonica. Family, all of them, depending on the ranch's success. "What about the east field?" she asked suddenly. "The one you said was too rocky for grazing." James looked up. "What about it? I've been reading some of Sarah's old agricultural journals. There's an article about winter wheat. It actually does better in rocky soil, needs less water. If we planted in that field, we'd need seed money," James said, but she could see him considering it. "And none of us know much about wheat farming." Grace smiled. "But I know someone who does. Remember that letter from my cousin Edward last week? His farm in Kansas?" They worked late into the night, the ledger between them filling with new calculations. Grace's education and Sarah's careful notes, combined with James's years of ranch experience, creating possibilities where none had seemed to exist. "We'll need to talk to the hands," James said finally. "Some of them might not take to the idea of becoming part-time wheat farmers. Then we'll help them understand. Tom's always said he wanted to learn new skills. And Billy, did you know he's been studying Sarah's farming books in the evenings? I found him asleep over one just last week." Dawn found them still planning. The ledger now transformed from a record of problems to a blueprint for survival. When the ranch hands gathered for breakfast, James and Grace presented their idea together. "It's not just about saving the ranch," Grace explained, her teacher's gift for explanation making the complex plan clear. "It's about making it stronger, diversifying, so we're not at the mercy of cattle prices alone. Besides," James added with a small smile, "I hear tell that wheat farmers don't have to ride herd in blizzards." Tom was the first to speak up. "Reckon I could learn to drive a plow as well as I drive cattle. Ma always said I had farming hands anyway." One by one, the others agreed. Old Pete offered that his father had been a wheat farmer in Ohio. Billy's eyes shone with the excitement of learning something new. Even Joaquin, usually quiet, spoke up about similar methods he'd seen in California. The next weeks were a flurry of activity. Grace wrote long letters to her cousin Edward, getting detailed advice about winter wheat cultivation. James rode to neighboring ranches, building a network of shared knowledge and resources. The East Field, long ignored, came alive with the sound of men clearing rocks and preparing soil. They made other changes too. Grace's educational background proved invaluable in negotiating better rates with the railroad, her Boston manners and quiet confidence impressing the regional manager. James's reputation for honesty helped secure credit from merchants who were turning others away. The ledger gained new columns, its pages filling with different kinds of calculations. Grace added her own notes in the margins, continuing Sarah's tradition of recording more than just numbers. "First wheat planted today," she wrote one evening. "The hands have named the East Field Grace's Garden, though I tell them it's far too big for that." James just smiles. Later that night, after the evening chores were done and the house had settled into quiet, James found Grace in the study, still poring over the ledger. "You know," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "When I married you, I thought I was just getting a wife. Instead, I got a business partner, a teacher for the hands, and the best thing that's happened to this ranch since Sarah helped me build it." Grace looked up from her calculations. "And I thought I was just getting a husband. Instead, I got a family, a purpose, and the chance to use everything I am, not just the parts that fit someone else's expectations." James touched the ledger gently. "Sarah would be proud of how you're carrying on her work. Different way, different strengths, but the same heart. We'll make it through this winter," Grace said with quiet certainty. "And come spring, we'll be stronger for having faced it together." Outside, a light snow began to fall on the east field, covering the newly planted wheat like a blessing. The telegram arrived with Tom's weekly supply run. "Arriving Silver Creek Station. Thursday, stop. Elizabeth, stop." Grace read it twice, her heart racing. Her sister had mentioned visiting in the spring, but this was barely February, and there'd been no warning. "Elizabeth was always one for dramatic entrances," she told James that evening, smoothing the telegram on the kitchen table. "She probably thinks she's riding to my rescue." James looked up from Sarah's cookbook, where he'd been studying bread. Recipes, a new hobby he'd taken up on quiet evenings. "Then we'll just have to show her there's no rescue needed." Thursday dawned clear and cold. Grace found herself fussing with the parlor curtains, straightening books, touching the fingerprints. On the window panes, everything looked different through imagined Boston eyes. "Leave those be," James said gently, catching her hand as she reached for yet another imagined dust speck. "This is our home, not a museum." They took the wagon into town together, Grace, wearing her best dress and trying not to fidget. The train was on time for once, and there was Elizabeth on the platform, petite, perfectly dressed, looking exactly as she had in Boston, except for the expression of absolute shock when she saw Grace. "Good heavens!" Elizabeth breathed as Grace helped her down from the train. "You're glowing." "It's the prairie air," Grace smiled, hugging her sister. "Elizabeth, this is James." Elizabeth had to tilt her head back to meet James's eyes, but Grace saw the moment her sister's carefully prepared judgments began to waver. James had that effect on people. His quiet dignity and genuine warmth had a way of dismantling preconceptions. "Welcome to Montana Territory, Miss Thompson," he said, touching his hat. "We hope you'll find our humble home comfortable." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose at humble, but she allowed James to help her into the wagon with perfect grace. As they drove toward the ranch, Grace watched her sister taking in the vast landscape, the distant mountains, the endless sky. "It's so big," Elizabeth said finally. "That's what I love about it," Grace replied. "Room to grow in every direction." They crested the last hill and the ranch spread before them. House, barns, the new wheat field green with winter growth. Grace heard Elizabeth's small intake of breath. "This is humble," her sister whispered. "It's home," Grace said simply. The ranch hands had clearly been preparing for Elizabeth's arrival. Tom and Billy wore their Sunday best. The yard was immaculate, and even old Pete had trimmed his beard. But it was Joaquin who truly broke the ice, stepping forward with a bouquet of hothouse flowers he'd ordered specially from Silver Creek. "Welcome to the family, Miss Elizabeth," he said, with a small bow that would have graced any Boston parlor. Elizabeth accepted the flowers with genuine pleasure, and Grace saw another piece of her sister's armor crack. Inside, the house showed its own welcome. A fire crackled in the hearth, fresh-baked bread scented the air, and Sarah's, now Grace's, prized china gleamed on the dining room table. But it was the study that finally conquered Elizabeth's remaining doubts. "Shakespeare?" she exclaimed, examining the well-worn volumes. "Dickens! Why, you have a better library than some homes in Boston." "Sarah started it," James explained. "Grace has added her own touches." He nodded toward the corner where Jane Eyre sat next to books on wheat farming and cattle breeding. "And the ranch hands borrow them," Grace added. Billy's halfway through David Copperfield, and Tom's discovered a passion for poetry. Elizabeth sank into one of the reading chairs, looking slightly dazed. When Mother said you'd married a rancher, I imagined, well, something quite different. Life has a way of surprising us, James said quietly. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd find love again at a train station, I wouldn't have believed it either. That evening, after a dinner that showed off Grace's growing culinary skills, they gathered in the parlor. The ranch hands joined them, as was their custom, and Elizabeth watched in amazement as Billy and Tom performed a scene from Romeo and Juliet they'd been practicing. "They're quite good," she whispered to Grace. "Wait until you hear old Pete recite Longfellow," Grace whispered back. "He knows Hiawatha by heart." Later, as Elizabeth was preparing for bed in the guest room, Grace found her standing at the window, looking out at the starlit prairie. "I came here thinking I needed to save you," Elizabeth admitted, "to convince you to come back to Boston where you belonged." She turned to face her sister. "But you already are where you belong, aren't you?" Grace joined her at the window. In the distance, a coyote called, and somewhere in the barn, a horse nickered softly. "I found my place," she said, "not just as James's wife, but as myself. All of myself." Elizabeth took her hand. "Then I suppose I'll have to tell Mother to stop measuring potential suitors. Though I must say," she added with a small smile, "I rather like the idea of having a ranch to visit, especially one with such literary cowboys." Outside, the Montana night spread its star-filled canvas over the ranch, while inside, the warmth of family, both old and new, filled every corner of the house that had become, truly and finally, Grace's home. The quilt had begun as a way to pass the long winter evenings. Grace found the trunk of fabric scraps in the attic, pieces of Sarah's old dresses, worn-out work shirts, even a square of James's mother's wedding dress. Each piece held a story, and as she worked, James would tell them to her, while the wind howled outside. "That blue calico," he'd say, watching her fingers move steadily with needle and thread. "Sarah wore that dress the day we first saw the ranch. Said the color matched the Montana sky." Or, "That red-checked piece was from my first proper shirt. Mother made it for church socials." Grace added her own contributions, a square from her ill-fated wedding dress, now transformed into something new, a piece of the apron she'd worn while learning to make bread. The handkerchief James had first offered her at the station, carefully incorporated into the center of the design. February proved to be the hardest month. The winter wheat lay dormant under feet of snow, and the cattle huddled in the sheltered valleys, requiring constant attention. The ranch hands took turns, sleeping in the barn to tend to the pregnant heifers, their bedrolls spread in the hayloft. One particularly bitter night, Grace woke to find James's side of the bed empty. She knew where he'd be, out checking the herd with Tom, fighting through snowdrifts higher than a horse's chest. Unable to sleep, she went down to the kitchen and started a pot of coffee, then returned to her quilting by lamplight. The sound of the door opening brought her head up hours later. James and Tom stumbled in, snow-covered and exhausted. "Lost one of the young heifers," James said heavily, accepting the coffee she pressed into his hands. "But saved her calf. Tom's got it." In the barn, wrapped in blankets, Grace was already moving, gathering supplies. "I'll help him tend to it. You get warm." In the barn, she found Tom trying to coax the newborn calf to drink from a bottle. The tiny creature was weak, its chances uncertain. Grace spread her unfinished quilt over it, adding extra warmth to the blankets. "My grandmother always said quilts had healing power," she told Tom. "All those memories and hopes stitched together." They took turns through the night, feeding the calf tiny amounts, rubbing its legs to keep blood flowing. By dawn, the little creature was struggling to stand, its survivor's spirit matching the determination of its caretakers. "Think we'll call this one Grace's hope," Tom said, his tired face breaking into a smile as the calf took another wobbly step. "On account of the quilt and all. The winter seemed to last forever, yet they found ways to make the endless white days rich with meaning." Grace taught the ranch hands to read poetry by lamplight, their rough voices growing confident with practice. James shared stories of earlier winters, of lessons learned and hardships overcome. Billy discovered a talent for mimicry, entertaining them all with perfect imitations of the local townsfolk. Old Pete taught Grace to play checkers, though he suspected she let him win more often than not. Joaquin shared recipes from his mother, filling the kitchen with warm scents of chilies and corn. Through it all, Grace's quilt grew, incorporating new squares that told the story of their first winter together. A piece of the blanket that had saved Grace's hope, a scrap from Billy's shirt, torn during a dramatic reading of The Tempest, the handkerchief Martha Henderson had given her after a particularly moving church service. One evening, as she worked on the final border, James watched her from his chair by the fire. "You know what that quilt reminds me of?" he asked. Grace looked up, needle poised. "What?" "Us. This ranch. All these different pieces that shouldn't necessarily fit together, but somehow make something beautiful when they do." She smiled, seeing the truth in his words. The elegant fabric from her Boston dresses beside rough denim from work clothes, delicate lace against sturdy flannel, Sarah's past and Grace's present, woven together with careful stitches and loving intention. The first hint of spring came in late March, a warm wind that carried the promise of change. The winter wheat began to show green through the melting snow, and new calves dotted the pastures like scattered clouds. Grace finished the quilt on a Sunday afternoon, just as the light was turning golden. The ranch hands gathered to admire it, each pointing out squares they recognized, laughing at remembered moments from the long winter just past. "It's not quite symmetrical," she said, spreading it on the bed she shared with James. "And some of the stitches are a bit uneven, James." He touched the center square, that first handkerchief, the one that had started their story. "That's what makes it perfect," he said. "Like life, like love. Not perfect in the way some might measure it, but perfect in the way it fits." That night, as they lay beneath the quilt that told their story in fabric and thread, Grace thought about the coming spring, about new calves and growing wheat, and the endless possibilities that stretched before them. The winter had tested them, but like the strongest quilting stitches, it had only served to bind them more tightly together. The seed packets lay spread across the kitchen table like a promise. Tomatoes, peas, herbs, and flowers of every description. Grace had ordered them from a catalogue months ago, during the depths of winter, and now they'd finally arrived. Each paper envelope bore her careful handwriting, notes about planting depths, growing times, and optimal conditions, knowledge gleaned from Sarah's gardening journals and her own Boston conservatory experiences. "It's ambitious," James said, studying the garden plan she'd drawn. The paper showed neat rows and circles, a marriage of Sarah's original garden layout and Grace's new vision. But if anyone can make it work, you can. The morning was cool, but held the unmistakable scent of spring. Through the window, they could see the winter wheat stretching toward the sun, a sea of green promise. The cattle grazed contentedly in the distance, new calves frolicking on strengthening legs. "I thought we could expand the herb section here," Grace explained, pointing to her diagram. "Martha Henderson mentioned that the town doctor is always looking for medicinal herbs, and here," her finger moved to another section, "a cut-flower garden. The church ladies would pay well for fresh bouquets." James smiled at her practical approach to beauty. Sarah always said a ranch wife needed to be part farmer, part businesswoman. She'd appreciate how you're combining the two. They took their planning outside, where the morning sun had warmed the earth. The garden shed key hung familiar and comfortable around Grace's neck as she unlocked the door. Inside, tools waited patiently. Sarah's gardening implements, now joined by new ones James had bought in town, sized better for Grace's height. "I've been thinking," James said as they began turning the soil, "about what you said regarding the flower business. What if we added a greenhouse, nothing fancy, but enough to extend the growing season? The town's growing and people miss gardens in winter." Grace paused, spade in hand. "That would be, James, that's brilliant. We could grow vegetables too, have fresh produce when everything's snow-covered. The ranch hands would love that." And, he added with a twinkle in his eye, it would give Billy somewhere warm to practice his Shakespeare in winter. They worked together through the morning, the ranch hands joining them when their other chores were done. Tom revealed a surprising knowledge of soil composition, learned from his grandmother. Old Pete fashioned clever tools for reaching difficult spots, and Joaquin shared his mother's secrets for companion planting. The beans help the corn grow stronger, he explained, demonstrating how to arrange the plantings. And the squash keeps the soil cool for both. My mother calls them the three sisters. Grace incorporated his wisdom into her plan, just as she'd woven different fabrics into her winter quilt. The garden began to take shape. Not just Sarah's garden restored, but something new. Something that, like the ranch itself, drew strength from multiple traditions. As the sun climbed higher, Martha Henderson arrived with a basket of fresh scones and news from town. The Ladies' Aid Society is planning a spring festival, she announced. They're hoping you'll contribute some of your flowers, Grace. And James, they want you to judge the horse competitions. We'd be honored, Grace said, exchanging a knowing look with James. They'd earned their place in the community, not through conformity, but through being genuinely themselves. Later, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, they sat on the porch reviewing the day's work. The garden beds lay ready for planting, neat rows marked with string and stakes. The greenhouse was sketched out on paper, with Tom already calculating lumber needs. In the kitchen, Billy and Joaquin were preparing dinner, their voices raised, in an off-key but enthusiastic rendition of a song from Pirates of Penzance. I've been corresponding with Elizabeth, Grace said, pulling a letter from her apron pocket. She's thinking of visiting again in the summer, when the flowers are blooming, and she mentioned that several of my former students are interested in teaching opportunities out here. James raised an eyebrow. Oh? Silver Creek is growing. They'll need more teachers soon. I thought perhaps... She hesitated. Perhaps we could help establish a proper school. Not just reading lessons in the evenings, but a real school. The ranch is doing well enough now to invest in the future, James finished. I think that's a fine idea. This land gave me a chance to build something lasting. Seems right to help. Others do the same. Grace leaned against him, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. The seed packets in her pocket felt like possibilities waiting to bloom. When I first came west, I thought I was leaving everything behind. Instead, I was bringing it with me, finding new ways to help things grow. James took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers like roots seeking fertile soil. That's what you do best, love. You take what's already here and make it richer, like turning a simple ranch garden into a business, or a group of cowboys into Shakespeare enthusiasts, or a marriage of convenience into something beautiful. She added softly, in the garden, the first spring birds were returning, their songs carrying the promise of new beginnings. Tomorrow they would plant the seeds, each one a promise of future harvest. But for now, they simply sat together, watching their world grow in the lengthening light of a Montana spring. The hand-carved wooden box was James's secret project, worked on in the barn during stolen moments over several weeks. He'd chosen aged maple wood, knowing its golden warmth would match the tone of Grace's hair in sunlight. Into the lid, he carefully carved roses and morning glories, the first flowers she'd planted in their garden, twining around the edges to frame the date they'd met at the railroad station. Inside, he'd created small compartments, each lined with velvet from one of Sarah's old dresses. Each space waited to hold a memory: the handkerchief from their first meeting, pressed flowers from their impromptu wedding, the telegram announcing Elizabeth's first visit, a scrap from Grace's famous quilt, and a small sheaf of winter wheat. From their first harvest, the anniversary morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of autumn day that had brought them together a year before. Grace woke to find James's side of the bed empty, but on his pillow lay a volume of Shakespeare open to The Tempest, with a pressed Morning Glory marking the page. My library was dukedom, large enough. Downstairs, she found the ranch hands had conspired with James for a celebration. The kitchen table bore a feast of her favorite breakfast foods, each prepared by a different member of their makeshift family. Tom's biscuits, Billy's scrambled eggs, old Pete's famed flapjacks, and Joaquin's spiced hot chocolate all waited under. Careful covers. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. McKinnon," they chorused as she entered, then quickly made themselves scarce, leaving her to find James waiting on the porch, the carved box in his hands. "I thought we might take breakfast by the creek," he suggested, offering his arm, "where we can see both the cattle and your gardens." They walked together through the morning mist, past the thriving greenhouse where late tomatoes still ripened, past the wheat field now stubbled gold after harvest. The creek burbled peacefully, and James spread a blanket, the anniversary quilt, on its banks. "A year ago today," he said, settling beside her, "I rode into town for supplies and found my future waiting at a train station." Grace touched Sarah's ring, now worn smooth by months of ranch work and garden tending. "A year ago today, I thought my life was ending. Instead, it was just beginning." James presented the box, watching as she traced the carved flowers with gentle fingers. "Open it," he urged softly. Each compartment held its memory, and with each one they shared remembrances. The handkerchief brought laughter about their first awkward meeting. The pressed flowers led to tales about Stanley Henderson's perfect timing with his Bible. The telegram sparked stories about Elizabeth's transformation from worried sister to proud defender of their unconventional marriage. But it was the wheat sheaf that brought tears to Grace's eyes. "Our first real harvest together," she whispered. "The first of many," James assured her. "The railroad agent said our wheat grade was among the highest he'd seen. Not bad for a couple of novice farmers." Grace had her own surprise for James. From her pocket, she drew a small journal bound in soft leather. "I've been writing our story," she explained, "not just for us, but for those who come after. About how love can find us when we least expect it, and how the measure of a life isn't in its height or depth, but in how far it reaches to touch others." She opened the journal to share some passages, her first impressions of the ranch, the quiet moments of falling in love day by day, the challenges they'd faced together. She'd recorded the ranch hands' growing appreciation for literature, the town's gradual acceptance of their unusual marriage, the way their home had become a gathering place for both cattle workers and culture seekers. "There's plenty of empty pages left," she said, "for all the stories yet to come." Their quiet breakfast was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. The ranch hands appeared, dressed in their Sunday best, leading Thunder and Bell, both groomed to gleaming. "Begging your pardon," Tom said, trying to hide a smile, "but there's a small gathering waiting at the station. Seems the whole town wants to celebrate with you where it all began." "Stanley Henderson's idea," Billy added. "He says first anniversaries should be celebrated proper, especially ones he helped create." James helped Grace to her feet, both of them laughing at the conspiracy. "Shall we ride to town, Mrs. McKinnon? I hear there's something special waiting at the station." "As long as it's not another abandoned bride," Grace teased, then softened the joke by kissing him. "Though that did work out rather well last time." They rode to town side by side, the carved box and journals safely stowed in their saddlebags, the ranch hands following behind like an honor guard. The morning sun caught Sarah's ring, making it glow like a beacon of hope fulfilled. "We are such stuff as dreams are made on," James quoted softly. Grace smiled, completing the line. "And our little life is rounded with a sleep. Though I must say, Mr. McKinnon, this feels far more like a waking dream." The railroad station waited ahead, just as it had a year ago, but now it wasn't a place of endings, but of beginnings. A reminder that sometimes the best journeys are the ones that bring us home to where we're meant to be. The handkerchief was no longer pristine white, though Grace had bleached it carefully. A year of use had softened its edges, and in one corner she'd embroidered their initials, G and J, entwined with morning glories. She'd taken to carrying it in her pocket, a tangible reminder of how a simple gesture of kindness could change lives. Today, that lesson would come full circle. Their anniversary celebration at the station had just wound down, the townspeople dispersing, with final well wishes when the afternoon train whistled its approach. Grace and James lingered on the platform, sharing private smiles about this place where their story had begun. Stanley Henderson emerged from his office, looking troubled. "Got a wire about a passenger," he said quietly. "Young man, lost everything. In a Chicago fire. Headed west because there's nothing left behind him." Grace and James exchanged glances, remembering other moments of loss and new beginnings. The train pulled in with a hiss of steam and screech of brakes. Among the few passengers who disembarked was a young man in soot-stained clothes, clutching a small valise. His face bore the hollow look of someone who had watched his world burn to ashes. Before James could move, Grace was already approaching, the embroidered handkerchief ready in her hand. "You look like you could use this," she said softly, offering it to him. "The prairie dust can be hard on city folks." The young man took it automatically, then really looked at her and up at her, for he was of average height. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only a glimpse of desperate gratitude for this small kindness. "Robert Perkins," he managed, his voice rough with more than trail dust. "I had a bookshop in Chicago. Now—" He gestured helplessly at his valise. "A few books are all I saved." "Books?" James stepped forward, interested. "We're actually discussing starting a school in Silver Creek. Been looking for someone with knowledge of literature." Grace caught the familiar twinkle in her husband's eye and smoothly added, "You must be exhausted, Mr. Perkins. Our ranch is nearby, and we were just about to have supper. Perhaps you'd join us. We can discuss books and possibilities." Robert looked between them, clutching the handkerchief like a lifeline. "I wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition," James assured him. "Our home always has room for another reader. Besides," he smiled at Grace, "we have a tradition of helping lost souls who find themselves at this station." As they led Robert to their wagon, Grace noticed Stanley Henderson watching from his office window, a knowing smile on his face. The station master raised his hand in a small salute. To them, to Providence, to the mysterious ways that brought the right people to the right place at the right time. The ride home was filled with conversation about books, teaching, and dreams. Robert's knowledge of literature matched Grace's, and his eyes lit up when James mentioned their Shakespeare-quoting ranch hands. "We'll need to add to the library," Grace mused, "if we're really starting a school. And perhaps a bookshop in town," James suggested. "Silver Creek's growing. Might be time for some culture beyond my cattle reports." Robert sat straighter, hope beginning to replace despair in his expression. "You really think there'd be interest in books?" Grace laughed. "Mr. Perkins, wait until you meet our ranch hands. Billy can recite entire scenes from Romeo and Juliet, and Tom's poetry readings could move a stone to tears." As they approached the ranch, the setting sun painted the scene in familiar shades of amber and rose. The wheat field glowed golden, the garden bloomed with late summer flowers, and smoke rose invitingly from the chimney where the hands would be preparing dinner. Grace touched the empty spot in her pocket where the handkerchief had been, then reached for James's hand instead. A year ago, she'd been the lost soul at the station, thinking her dreams had ended. Now she was home, surrounded by love, helping others find their way. "There are more things in heaven and earth," James quoted softly, squeezing her hand. Grace smiled, watching Robert's face as he took in the ranch, the gardens, the promise of new beginnings. "Than are dreamt of in your philosophy," she completed the quote. The ranch house waited ahead, warm lights glowing in welcome. Inside, their anniversary box held memories of a love story that had begun with a handkerchief and a moment of kindness. Now they were adding new pages to their story, helping write happy endings for others. Or perhaps, Grace thought as they turned up the drive, not endings at all. Just new beginnings, as endless as the Montana sky above them, as boundless as love itself.